I saw it first at the Toronto International Film Festival, and I saw that the same day that I saw Sound of Falling. And what I find so fascinating about both movies is that they have these elliptical narratives. But before even getting into the conversation about the movie, um, is David Cronenberg's The Dead Zone your favorite movie of his?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm no authority on Cronenberg. Everything I've seen of his, I like. But The Dead Zone is something that I absolutely love, and it was to do with when I watched it. I watched it when I was far too young. It was shown on Christmas Eve, um, when I was about 10, I reckon. And normally I wouldn't be up that late, but it was Christmas Eve, and I stayed up, and I sat with my mum, and like the midnight movie came on at 10 o'clock movie or whatever, Christmas Eve, in that gap before they cut to St Paul's Cathedral or wherever to show midnight mass. And so I watched this film because I was up, and oh my god, it, it stayed with me ever since. And there was a long period of time where I didn't watch it, and I'd kind of forgotten about it on a conscious level, but subconsciously it was there in my mind. And then I saw the DVD of it a few years ago and just bought it. I thought, oh wow, that's The Dead Zone. I haven't watched that for a long time, and it was the first time in a long time that I'd watched a film and I watched it, and as soon as it finished, I just watched it again because it was bringing back so many things for me from my past. And then the second time I watched it, it was to look at it as a film.
There's a line of dialogue that I wanted to ask you about. It's when you have Nick and Liam becoming more aware of the situation they find themselves in, and once they've gone back on the Rose of Nevada for the second time, you have Nick saying to Liam, "What you're doing is probably illegal, and it's still pretty bleak if it's not." And was that you commenting on your rewatch of Quantum Leap in that moment?
Yeah, it was exactly that. I watched Quantum Leap for a bit of a. I thought it was the easiest way to get a handle on quantum physics rather than reading a big textbook. I thought I'd get the box set of Quantum Leap, which I did, which is something that I loved as a teenager when I watched it, in the 90s. And then I watched it. I thought there's a problem with this, an ethical, sort of a moral problem in the lead character who we're supposed to empathize with is there's a question of consent about the relationships he's having because people think that he's somebody else. And I thought I've got that issue in Rose of Nevada, and I thought, well, I've got to point at it. A friend of mine, another filmmaker, Brett Harvey, said to me about plot holes. I think he was quoting Ridley Scott. He said, if you've got a plot hole, then point at it. That's the way to deal with a plot hole. And I thought this wasn't a plot hole, but it was a morality hole. And I was like, I've got to point at it. So it does it in two ways. One, the conversation on the sofa while they're watching TV. There's a conversation about, can I tell you something? Does it matter? There's an ambiguous conversation about him maybe trying to tell her that he isn't who she thinks he is. And she shuts him down. And I wanted to leave that ambiguous so that maybe she knows, maybe she doesn't know. But him saying that is prompted by the fact that Georgie's character says, she thinks you're somebody else. What you're doing is probably illegal, in that there is an issue of consent there. It's important for me, that moment, that it's left ambiguous. Else there are some questions.
Well, absolutely, and I think it's a good thing to ask these questions as well, and to consider it because like it's fascinating to think about who knows how much. Like, how much does Mike know? How much does Tina know? About what's going to happen, or if this is a cyclical experience.
Well,
Um,
that was exactly where the film came from, because originally I had just the opening scene about the boat returning after 30 years, and I'd never developed it into a longer story because I just thought, well, the film would just be about where's this boat come from, and it would just be a mystery about the boat and where it had been. And then Mary, my partner, who's also in the film, said to me, well, what if not everybody in the community is surprised that the boat's come back? And then that becomes really interesting because then it's a mystery about why people aren't surprised, and there's a lot of ambiguity about who knows what, and who turns a blind eye to things for the greater good.
were there less limitations on Rose of Nevada, and did you set any limitations for yourself while making the movie? Because you have talked in the past how limitations are a part of your creative process.
We weren't short of anything when we were making it. It had a much bigger art department as well. but that was partly because we were really making a period drama. Although I took a long time to accept that 1993 was a period drama, because to me that's like 10 years ago. So the art department was bigger, the production side of it was bigger. Denzel Monk, the producer, had a bigger team around him, and and needed it because it was a much bigger endeavor. But I made sure that it's still me working with a clockwork camera, no location sound, um, no VFX. Everything's practical. Everything's done in camera. Everything's done in front of the lens, and that was essential. I didn't want more resources, because I remember early on we had a meeting with the execs about how we were going to make the film when I'd written the script. And they were kind of saying to me, "How are you going to make it?" And I said, "Well, I'll probably use a cinematographer and I'll use a sound recordist and I'll probably work with an editor." And they were like, "Why?" And I was kind of in my head, I was thinking, "Well, don't I have to do that now that we've stepped up a budget level?" But nobody wanted me to do that. There was no pressure on me to do that. And in fact, after the meeting, I remember Denzel saying to me, they're financing this film because of the way you make films, not despite the way you make films. So it was incumbent on us to keep those limitations there, because I'm nothing without limitations. If I had the possibility to do anything, I'd do nothing, because I'd always be imagining something else. But I love going into a location, and like where we filmed all the fishing sequences was in the harbour, in an inner harbour, and if we look one way, you could see the town. If you look the other way, there was a big supermarket. So it was like, right, when we're shooting the fishing boat, we've got two angles that we can shoot. And I'm like, great. Then I don't have to think about anything. Somebody said, these are the two angles, and then you get busy within those two angles. So all of the limitations are absolutely essential to me.
Now, that's something as well I did want to ask you about because, obviously you're working with a Bolex 16 millimeter clockwork camera, and it's something you've talked about, before with Kodak. Does that play a role in the order in which you're shooting the film? And how does equipment like that fare when you're shooting on the sea? Do you have to be even more careful in terms of it not getting wet, or is it durable?
Yeah, completely. You have to be much less careful. I mean, the camp. I mean, salt water will kill anything, really. But I mean, we weren't at sea a lot of the time, and we were working with fresh water, out of the dump tanks and the water whooshers and wave machine stuff. Most of that was fresh water. So camera will get wet. I mean, my waterproof housing for the camera was a plastic bag from the supermarket with a hole cut in the front, taped up around the camera, and that's it. We had one camera that had like a vintage underwater housing that we could kind of throw into the sea. But other than that, there's no electronics. We don't have batteries. We don't. The only thing that died on the shoot, from my point of view, was my light meter, and that was user error because I actually dropped that on the deck of the boat into a lot of water, and that's electronic. So it died, and we had to replace that. But actually, by the end of the shoot, it'd come back to life again. By the time it dried out, 'cause it wasn't salt water, it'd come back to life. So no, the actual mechanics of making the film was so simple. So little, touch wood. There's so little that can go wrong. Because there's such a small amount of equipment we're actually using.
The grocery store security camera footage, was that shot on Bolex as well, or was that shot on a different camera?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was asked after a screening last night by a friend of mine saying he saw it, my friend Stuart, he saw it in Toronto actually as well, and then he watched it again last night at American Cinematheque. He said to me, "Oh, I forgot you've got that mini DV shot with the security camera." And I was like, "No, that was shot on a Bolex." We spent about 3 hours trying to rig a Bolex using various clamps next to the dummy CCTV camera, because that was shot in our little makeshift studio. So that CCTV camera was just stuck to the wall. And then we had to pin the Bolex next to it. And then I shot that footage on the Bolex, and then in the grade, in the color retiming, we then degraded it and turned it into lo-fi video. So kind of doing the opposite of what most people are doing, where they're shooting video and trying to make it look like film. We were taking this beautiful color negative 16 millimeter Bolex footage, beautifully lit, beautiful colors, and then taking everything out of it and degrading it and degrading it and degrading it to the point where I wanted it to almost be impossible to see what was going on, like that era of CCTV cameras. But yeah, every shot in the film is shot on the Bolex.
Amazing. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. Congratulations again on the film. I hope it gets a Blu-ray release because your last two movies aren't available on Blu-ray in North America, which is really disappointing.
Yeah, I think they're just available on DVD, right?
Yeah, and there's no special features either. There's none of the interviews with or audio commentary,
Right.
and I hope that 1/2 Special does a special edition with Vinegar Syndrome.
Watch this space is all I will say.
Perfect. Well, thank you
Right.
so much. I really
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Eric.
Bye.
Cheers.